One day, the handsome young man, Jarrett, was doing his job in the library normally. Jarrett was diligent and loved his work very much. He had loved reading since his childhood, and therefore he considered his work an excellent opportunity for him to be among books so he could read every day all the books he wanted to read. In that day, an elderly, thin man entered the library and gave one of the library employees his card, on which was written, Mr. John Eldred. The employee welcomed the man and asked him what he wanted. The man replied, "I want to borrow a book." The employee said to him, "Okay, go ahead." He answered her, "It's the first time I've visited this library, so I don't know where the books are here. Can someone help me find the book I'm looking for?" Meanwhile, the young man, Garrett, was passing by the man and heard what he was saying. He looked at him and said to him, "Of course, I can help you. Tell me the name of the book and I will find it for you immediately." Then the young man pointed toward a chair at the entrance to the library, saying, "You can rest here for a while until I find it for you." The old man thanked him and sat waiting for him in the chair next to the door. Jarrett went to the library's catalog and began searching for the name of the book that the man mentioned. The name of the books was the Tractate Middith. Jarrett immediately found the book, and its number was 11334. Here, Jarrett immediately went to the section in which the book is placed, but unfortunately, Jarrett was unable to find the book anywhere. And then he remembered that there was an old man wearing a black coat who was in the same department and must have borrowed the same book. So Jarrett returned to Mr. Eldred and told him, apologetically, that there was a man wearing a black coat. He borrowed the book and said to him that he was very sorry, but that Mr. Eldred could wait a while, so perhaps he would see this man who borrowed the book. Garrett began to describe the man to Mr. Eldred, saying that he was an old man, short, wearing a black coat. Mr. Eldred agreed, immediately saying, "It's okay. I won't wait now because I'm tired and I have to catch the train to go home. Thank you. I will come back again tomorrow, and maybe then I will find the book, or maybe I will know who has the book." "Of course," Garrett replied, and Eldred immediately left the library. Jarrett kept thinking all day about that book that Mr. Eldred had asked for. He did not know why, but something inside him told him to go look for the book again, and Jarrett actually returned to the place of the book. He thought that he might encounter the old man since Mr. Eldred did not see him while he was leaving, and he thought that if he found him, he might ask him to give the book to Mr. Eldred, and this man could come back again after a few days to borrow the book as he wanted. But when he arrived at the place of the book, he found the book, the Tractate Middith, and it was in the right place. Garrett felt bad and began to blame himself. How could he not see the book in its place when he searched for it before? And then he decided to wait until tomorrow, as Mr. Eldred told him, to give him the book himself. The next morning, Mr. Eldred entered the library and went straight to Garrett. He smiled at Mr. Eldred and said, "Good morning." Mr. Eldred said to him, "How are you?" Garrett replied with a smile, "I'm fine. I sincerely apologize for what happened yesterday. I was sure that the old man took the book with him, but fortunately I found it in the library yesterday after you left. Rest a little and I will quickly go get the book for you." Mr. Eldred immediately agreed, feeling excited that he would finally have the book. He sat down to wait for the young man, Garrett, who rushed into the library sections to get the book. Mr. Eldred waited a long time, and when he looked at his watch, he realized that more than 20 minutes had passed since Garrett had entered to search for the book. And here he went to the employee in the library who was standing behind the reception desk and asked her, "Are the sections for old books in the library that Jarrett is searching through far away?" The employee looked at him, not understanding what he meant, and then she said to him, "No, it is not far at all, sir." Then she continued her speech. "It is strange that he is taking so long. Let me go to check on what he is doing." Indeed, the employee immediately moved in the same direction. She was gone for several minutes and then returned again with worry face. She went directly to Mr. Eldred and said, "I'm very sorry, sir, but something happened to Mr. Garrett. He suddenly fell ill while he was looking for your book, and it was necessary to return home immediately." Mr. Eldred was surprised and responded to the employee speaking to him very politely, saying, "I am very sorry for what happened to Mr. Garrett. He was trying very hard to help me. I would very much like to go to his house to ask how he is. Can you help me and give me his address?" The woman nodded and said, "Of course." She gave Mr. Eldred Garrett's address. Mr. Eldred thanked her as he left, but he turned to her again and asked, "Did you see an old man in a black coat leaving the library shortly after I was here yesterday afternoon?" The employee immediately replied, "No, I did not. There were only 2 or 3 men here yesterday in the afternoon. They were all very young, I think." Mr. Eldred thanked her again and left the library, heading to Garrett's house. Mr. Eldred arrived at Jarrett's house and knocked on the door. The maid opened it and invited him into the reception room. Jarrett was there, surrounding himself with a blanket and sitting on one of the chairs near the fireplace. His face was very pale, and he looked clearly ill. Jarrett said apologetically to Mr. Eldred, "I'm sorry, sir, for all the trouble I've caused you." Eldred said to him with pity, "Don't worry about it. Tell me what happened to you. Did you fall? Did you see something?" Garrett was surprised by what he heard. The question was strange, too specific, as if Mr. Eldred knew what happened with him. But despite that, he did not care and said to him, "Well, yes, I fell because I saw something." And then Jarrett started to tell Mr. Eldred what he saw in the room. Mr. Eldred stopped him saying, "You will make yourself sick again." Jarrett wanted to talk. He said, "But I want to tell anyone what happened." Mr. Eldred stood up saying, "Not now, young man, not now. I am afraid that I should go now." He did not understand the reason for the reaction of Mr. Eldred, but he thanked him for his visit and then told him about the exact book number in the library so that he can be able to find the book himself at any time he goes to the library without anyone's help. The next day, Jarrett returned to the library, and Mr. Eldred never returned to that library. After some time had passed, Mr. George Earle, the library director, called Jarrett to speak to him. Mr. George had a good relationship with Jarrett, and that is why he wanted to know what had happened. Jarrett sat down in front of Mr. George after he greeted him, and then George said directly, "Listen, Garrett, I'm sure there's something strange going on in the library." Jarrett looked at him fearfully, as if he knew Mr. George was saying something true, and then said to him, "Why do you say that?" Mr. replied, "When you were late in the library, and we went to look for you, we found you lying on the floor unconscious. The smell in the place was very foul, a strong and foul smell that could not be normal. I've never smelled anything like it in my life, and none of us know its source." Garrett said as if he was thinking about something, "I did smell this smell, but it is not there all the time. I have only noticed this in the past few days." Mr. George asked him, "Did you feel sick because of that smell?" Jarrett shook his head in denial, saying, "No, that was not the reason. It was something I saw. Let me tell you the reason." Mr. George's face appeared focused on what Jarrett was saying. Jarrett continued speaking. "The day before yesterday, an old man named Mr. Eldred came looking for a book. At that time, I did not find it, and I thought that a short old man wearing black clothes had borrowed it. But when he left and I went back to look for the book, I found it in its place. Mr. Eldred came again yesterday, and when I went to get the book, I found the same short old man in black clothes taking the same book. I looked at the man to ask him to give me the book and come back to borrow it after several days, but when I looked at his face and focused on it this time, I saw something terrible. His skin was dry, brown, and had a lot of dust on it. He had no hair in his face or head at all. He was very ugly. He was holding the book I was looking for and reading in it, and then he turned to me. He had no eyes. The place where his eyes were was completely empty. It was a shock to me, and then everything went black, and I no longer heard or saw anything, and I don't remember anything else." Mr. George did not understand what happened, but he felt fear and pity for Garrett, and then he told him, "Okay, go back to your work now, and tomorrow you can take a week off. Go somewhere far away, breathe some fresh air. Try to forget that terrible experience." It was an excellent idea for Jarrett. He returned home the same day and packed his bags. The next morning, he went to the train station and booked a ticket to Burnstow-on-Sea. The train arrived and Jarrett stopped to get on it, but he found that all the carriages were full of passengers except one. It is the one in which there are empty seats. So Jarrett got into that carriage. But when he got into that carriage, he looked in front of him and saw the face of the short old man who had no eyes. Jarrett felt terrified and did not know what he should do now, especially since the train began to move. Jarrett ran with his bag to the next car and jumped into it, and then he lost control of himself completely and felt sick again and lost consciousness. But he woke up a few minutes later and found that a beautiful young woman was helping him to sit in one of the chairs on the train. Then that young woman gave him some sweets that she had it and stayed next to him until she was sure he was fine. The young woman and her mother were worried about the handsome young man, Garrett. When he began to feel better, he thanked the girl and her mother and began chatting with them. Garrett knew that Mrs. Simpson and her daughter were going to Burnstow-on-Sea too. They had an apartment there, and the woman and her daughter felt that Jarrett was a nice young man, and so they decided to invite him to stay in their apartment and spend his vacation with them. Jarrett accepted the invitation, because he felt attracted to the girl and felt that she also had some admiration for him. Indeed, Jarrett went to live with them, and there the relationship between them began to strengthen and became a friendship. And Garrett spent most of his vacation days, which were almost over, and at that time he was certain that he loved Mrs. Simpson's daughter. At the last dinner before his return to his home, Garrett was talking about his work in the library and his passion for books and reading. Mrs. Simpson said, "You remind me of my uncle, Dr. Rant." The lady started talking about her uncle and saying that he was the cause of their biggest problems. Garrett said to her, "Well, tell me, I can help you." Mrs. Simpson began to talk about her problems, saying, "I had an uncle named Dr. Rant. He was elderly, and I used to take care of him during his illness. My uncle did not marry, did not have any children, and he was left with nothing in the family except me, his niece, and another cousin. But my cousin was never interested in our elderly uncle, Dr. Rant, and he never visited him during the days of his illness. When my uncle, Dr. Rant, felt close to death, he decided to leave us his will. In that will, he left us specific instructions. These directions were for us to place his body in a special room under a field near his house and for him to wear normal clothes. Since that time, many people began to say they saw him. He was in his old black coat. This was 20 years ago. My uncle was wealthy and had a lot of property, including a large house. My cousin John and I knew that everything my uncle owned would pass to me and him. On the last day before he died, I was sitting next to him on the bed when my uncle suddenly opened his eyes and said, "Forgive me, Mary. I left everything to John in my will. Unfortunately, you will not get anything when I die." It was a shock to me. This was because this inheritance would have solved a lot of our problems, especially since my husband and I were not rich and we were in dire need of this money. At that time, I did not say anything because I felt that my uncle had more to say, and indeed, I was right. My uncle continued his speech saying, "But Mary, I do not love John. I think I was wrong, and that's why I decided that you should have everything. But first, you have to find the letter in which I wrote my will. I will not tell you where that will is, but I can tell you one thing. I left it in a book, Mary, and the book is not at home. I left the will in a book in a public place that John can access, but he doesn't know it yet. When I die, you will find an envelope in my office with your name written on it, and you will find something inside this envelope, something that will help you." It was only a few hours later, and my uncle had already died. At that time, I tried to send a letter to my cousin John Eldred, but of course he never responded to me. Immediately, he received my uncle's will with all his money, possessions, and even his house. My daughter and I had to return to live in our small apartment here in Burnstow-on-Sea. Garrett looked at Mrs. Simpson in surprise, stopped eating, and said, "Did you say John Eldred?" Mrs. Simpson nodded. "Yes. Do you know him?" He said to her, "I saw a man called John Eldred just a few days ago. He was a thin, old man." Mrs. Simpson said, "Yes, it looks like that. Where have you seen him?" Garrett said to her, "In a public place. I don't know if I should tell you where, but what about the envelope?" Mrs. Simpson stood up and went to the office in the same room. Then she took out the envelope and said to Garrett, "Yes, here he is." Then she opened the envelope and took out a small piece of paper with only 5 numbers written on it. Garrett thought for a moment, then asked Mrs. Simpson, "Do you think Mr. Eldred knows exactly where the book containing your uncle's letter is?" "Well, I don't know," Mrs. Simpson replied, "but people say he always goes to the library and bookstores, so he seems to know those numbers, but he doesn't seem to know where that book is." Jarrett sat silently thinking about this problem. The next day, Jarrett left Burnstow-on-Sea on the train to his home. At that time, he thought again about the numbers that were written on the paper inside the envelope, and he did not remember exactly the order of the numbers that were written on the paper. Was it January 13th, 34, or was it 11, 33.4, or was it November 3rd, 34? Because each of them means that the book was in a different section. Finally, the train arrived at its station. He went directly to the library and began searching the library catalog for the number 11, 33.4, but it was not the same book. So he started looking for the number November 3rd, 34. Fortunately, Jarrett found that it was the same book he was looking for. The woman replied, "How should I know? Do you think I can remember all the numbers of books people take?" So Garrett asked her again, "Well, is Mr. Eldred back here? The old man who was here the day I got sick?" she said, looking at one of the catalogs without interest. "No, he did not come back here himself, but he sent me some money, and he asked me to send him a book. I couldn't really refuse. What would you do if someone sent you some money and asked you to do the same thing?" "I suppose I shall do the same," replied Jarrett. Do you have the paper that Mr. Eldred sent you? And can you please give me his address?" The woman said, "This is the paper on which the book number was written. Book No. November 3rd, 34. Isn't this the number you told me you wanted?" Then she continued her speech. "Unfortunately, I did not keep the address." Garrett looked desperate, but asked the woman, "When was that?" She replied, "At 10:30 in the morning." Garrett thought to himself that it was now exactly 1 o'clock. He could catch up with the book before he reached Mr. Eldred's house. But how could he reach the address? He thought quickly and then remembered what Mrs. Simpson had said about John Eldred getting his uncle's house. And then he realized that the presence of this book in the library meant that Dr. Rant had donated the book to the library, which meant that Dr. Rant was on the library's list. And since he died 20 years ago, his name could be on the lists from 1870 to 1875. Then Jarrett began researching and found that on August 14, 1875, Dr. Rant of Britfield House donated a number of books to the library. And on the same page was written Dr. Rant's address. And when he got the address, he looked for it on the map and found that the trip from his place to Dr. Rant's house would take about 2 hours by train. And then he left for the station immediately and boarded the train, thinking all the time about what he would tell Mr. Eldred about the book and why he wanted it. Jarrett arrived at the train station and then saw 2 men taking a taxi. The taxi was just leaving the station, and it seemed to be heading in the same direction he wanted to go. He was sure that one of the 2 men was Mr. Eldred. Then Mr. John Eldred turned back and saw Jarrett standing at the station, but he did not care, because the car actually moved. Jarrett hurried to take another taxi to catch up with Mr. Eldred. He actually followed him to where Mr. Eldred got out of the car and began walking on foot towards the house. While he was walking quickly, something fell from his pocket. Jarrett hurried to pick up this thing and found that it was a box of matches. Then he continued to walk behind Mr. Eldred. It was getting dark and the light was starting to go. Mr. Eldred began to walk slowly. Then he picked up the book and began to browse through it. He was turning the pages as if he was searching for something. Then he stopped and felt in his pockets. It seemed he was looking for a matchbox, and when he discovered that it was not there, he felt nervous and was about to tear a page from the book. Before he could start tearing the book, something small and dark appeared from behind the trees. Its arms were long, black, and strong. Its arms were wrapped around his head and Mr. Eldred's neck. Mr. Eldred tried to resist silently with his arms and feet, but suddenly he stopped completely. This black entity left Mr. Eldred's body lying alone on the road, and then Garrett felt terrified and ran towards Mr. Eldred's body screaming. And there was another man running towards Mr. Eldred, and they both found out that Mr. Eldred was dead. The police came and picked up Mr. Eldred and began questioning Garrett and the other man. They both confirmed that there was something or someone who had attacked Mr. Eldred while he was walking holding a book. When the police began to examine the book, they found many notes written by old Dr. Rant, and these notes said that all the money and property that Dr. Rant owned and even the house belonged to Mrs. Mary Simpson and not to John Eldred. The investigation ended, and Mrs. Mary knew what had happened, and she actually received all the inheritance that her uncle, Dr. Rant, had left for her. Within several months, Garrett married Mrs. Simpson's daughter and resided with them in the same house as Dr. Rant.